You've been to North Korea, right?
Yeah.
What do you think Kim Jong-un's reality is?
He thinks his government is going to get invaded and destroyed. They don't care how many people they lose in order to protect their regime.
Do they understand that they're in a dictatorship?
No. If you're growing up in a dictatorship, it's everything that you know. They don't know what's going on outside.
Ignorance is bliss on a country level.
On a country level.
Wow. Do you think North Koreans know about BTS?
If they do, they better keep quiet about it, because if you're watching South Korean stuff, it's a death penalty.
What's the current status with the dictatorship in Syria?
So it is an absolutely murderous dictatorship. To this day, the press wants to tell you the civil war is over. It's going to erupt at any time again.
Mao's been one of the most brutal dictators in human history.
Yes, Mao Zedong was an equal opportunity slaughterer, and he destroyed most of the linkages that China had with its past. So, there are multi-generational consequences to what has happened out there. If you look at an image of Hirohito, you'll see, what a sweet old man. Oh no, this guy was every bit as psychotic as Hitler. There was no attempt made at truly colonizing China till the 1930s by the Japanese. That was nasty. Killing, slaughter of the Chinese by the Japanese army. It was serious sadistic crap. Hirohito knew exactly what was happening, and in many cases actually complained, saying, "You're not killing enough Chinese people, kill more of them."
I've always believed that social studies, especially when it comes to the Indian education system, are not taught in as entertaining a way as they can be taught. If Abhijit Iyer-Mitra is making his appearance on any podcast, you know it's going to be very direct, very brutal, and very uncensored. This is part 2 of our special on dictators. It's our attempt to take history to the Gen Z audiences, to explain the last 100 years of the human story to audiences that want to be told this story in an entertaining manner. Yes, it's brutal. Yes, it's gruesome. But this episode features someone who's a genuine lover of history, but also someone who's actually been to war-torn nations, who's traveled to North Korea, who's traveled to Syria, who's traveled to Afghanistan. Very, very enriching conversation. If you can reach the end of it, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this one with Abhijit Iyer-Mitra on TRS. Back with AIM. I think it's the need of the hour, especially for our country, to really deep dive into world history. We keep talking about India becoming a superpower. This is the general narrative in mainstream media.
Yeah.
I think that this is a part of becoming a superpower in the long term. Having global perspective. Love Indian history, love Indian culture, but it's important to look at what happened outside of India as well. Especially if you intend on traveling all over the world.
Yes.
Your knowledge about Indian history is not going to win you years abroad, but your knowledge and ability to speak about chapters of world history will. That's how you connect with people all over the globe.
Yep.
I kind of look at the knowledge levels that one has about global history and global affairs as a skill set.
It is. And you know why it's so important? Take America. America, you go to any country on earth, the best real estate in that capital would have been bought by the Americans 150, 200 years back. In Paris, the American embassy is right next to the Elysee Palace where the president lives. It's the same size as the president's palace, walking distance literally on the other side of the road. You go to England, prime land, originally in Mayfair near Grosvenor Park, and now they've got something by the riverside. And the best country house in Britain, the one for diplomatic showing off, belongs to the American ambassador. In Bangkok, the best diplomatic property is the American diplomatic property. In India, the best diplomatic property, and on Amrita Shergill Marg, they own about, which is, like the Malabar Hills of Delhi, they own about 10, 12 properties for all their chiefs of department and things like that. they had that global vision from the get-go. From 1776, when they got their independence, they were planning 150 years in the future to become a great power. They would go study everybody's history. You don't get that from American TV, which is so self-obsessed and self-referential. But there's a core bunch of wonks sitting in DC and government, which were always thinking in terms of big, bigger, biggest, global. In India, we've never had that, right? First thing you need to do is universities, but Indians don't travel. They want to go to Europe to be seen. You have to have that photo by Mount Matterhorn in Switzerland. You need to be filmed outside the Colosseum. But what did you actually learn of Rome and how Rome became a great power when you went to Rome, right? American students go, French students, British students, they go all over the world and they learn and bring back stuff. We don't. We have never had that global perspective. And there's a counter argument, which is that India is a very different country that way. Other countries have had horrible dictators. What was the last horrible dictator we had? Sui generis to come out of India. We're the only third world country which never went down the path of dictatorship. And even there, when the emergency is the closest we come to a dictatorship, 75 to 77, what Indira Gandhi declared, she was too much of a Democrat and she herself dissolved the emergency and called for elections, right? So she wasn't even a very good dictator at that. So, even our dictators tend to be too democratic for their own. I don't know if it's for their own good or their own bad, but whatever.
Do you think it's because we're a very emotional country, and on some level, just as Indians, we value human life too much and human relationships too much?
Do we? I think we don't value human life enough. Let me give you a simple example. We don't, our killing isn't through acts of commission like Stalin or Pol Pot or Mao. It's through acts of omission. So for example, to this day, every year 200,000 people die of tuberculosis. Have you ever tried to get rid of that? We have hundreds of thousands of deaths every year on the roads because of bad driving, bad signaling, whatever. Have you ever tried to fix our RTOs that give out licenses based on pure corruption? Pure corruption? No. The point I made earlier that the Mao Zedong killed 7 times the number of Chinese that the Japanese Imperial Army did. By omission, I think the Indian government would have ended up killing, post-independence Indian government would have ended up killing, by not doing anything, more Indians than the Brits would have done over a similar 70-year period.
Wow.
I mean, imagine 200,000 people dying per year in road accidents plus TB. 400,000 people a year dying simply because of government inaction. That's like famine level, no? Bengal famine killed 3 million people? I know. Yeah.
Let's re-enter the topic, keeping this India-China comparison in mind. There's been a shift within the span of the last 5-6 years. I remember the podcast that villainized China would actually get a lot of views back in the day. And over time, I think there's a more positive relationship that India has with China. And of course, there's a reflection of, how the geopolitical relations are supposedly healing between the two countries. I think it's very important to study the timeline of China, dialing back to 1947. Roughly then, that's when they'd got...
Roughly, yeah.
Post-World War II.
Yeah.
Would you say that India and China were neck and neck?
India was actually in some ways ahead of China.
In 1947?
In 1947. Remember, they'd been destroyed by the Japanese. And then they'd been destroyed by the Chinese Civil War itself between the Communist Party and the nationalist types. And then Mao Zedong himself did so much to destroy China even more. Like we discussed, 7 times the number of people killed by Mao than the Japanese. In fact, till 1980, India was consistently ahead of China. But from 1980 onwards, they've just skyrocketed. And how?
It was Mao Zedong's successor?
Deng Xiaoping. Successor,
in this phase?
Not his chosen successor. He never wanted Deng Xiaoping to succeed him in that sense. He chose a particularly nasty group. They were called the Gang of Four. They lasted for about a year and a half, and then Deng Xiaoping just took over because nobody else in the party wanted another lunatic like Mao again.
Like, definitely Mao's been one of the most brutal dictators
Yes.
in human history.
Yes.
Was there some kind of a base he created for China's future, or no? I'm just trying to explore that thought right now.
Yes, he did. And I'll tell you how. All old civilizations, especially super old civilizations like India and China, which are like, you can literally trace cultural continuity for 5,000 years. They tend to have huge amounts of historical baggage. Caste, the treatment of women, class, regionality, etc., etc. What Mao Zedong did was that he was an equal opportunity slaughterer, and he destroyed most of the linkages that China had with its past. He destroyed the male female dynamic, the landlord peasant dynamic. All of it was, China was so completely destroyed by Mao. The social fabric was destroyed.
Sorry, let's rewind a little bit. Let's go into World War II, World War One, China in the 1800s. Just we can give some quick context in order to build up Mao's origin story.
So 1700s is when industrialization really takes off in Europe. Till then, you can say China is more or less equivalent to Europe. Big empire, the Qing Empire, huge. It was the biggest country at that point of time on earth, because it included Mongolia and large parts of Russia as well. What is today Siberia, large parts of it were actually part of China. And what ended up happening was the East went on becoming more and more ossified, whereas Europe went on progressive. And the balance of power became so huge that China ultimately by the 1800s was no match for the European powers, right? Now, unlike India, which they could colonize completely, China was too big, too complex for them to go and colonize completely. The other thing that ended up happening was that with China, you had this sort of a very similar thing. In 1857, we had our great revolt or whatever, but there was no one central authority. The emperor was restricted to Delhi. Like, he didn't even control the whole of Delhi. He controlled hardly the Red Fort. So what, 10-acre part of Delhi. The Chinese emperor still controlled a lot. Now, it'll take hours for me to explain why they didn't completely colonize China, but they started taking lots of territories along the periphery of China, right? And that was absolutely crucial. Do you know Indians played a huge role in that? The opium wars that were foisted on China were actually done by the Tatars and the Sassoons. The Tatars and the Sassoons, the Sassoon Doxia, the big Jewish family, Baghdadi Jews, they were the original Pablo Escobars of the world.
Really?
Yeah. They claimed that their business started off sending Indian opium to China and addicting China. They were literally the original Medellin drug cartel and the Kali drug cartel. And what ended up happening was, they claimed they were British citizens. How dare China ban opium? Britain must go invade. So Britain did a lot of the bombardment and invasions of China to sell Indian drugs produced by Indian companies profiting Indians.
What was in it for the British?
Well, British Tatas and Sassoons pay taxes.
Okay.
So business, they were very commercial that way. They were very open-minded in terms of that commercial aspect of it. China falls so far behind that they're literally a lame duck. And misgovernance, dynasties, the problem with dynasties is maybe the first 2-3 rulers are good, but after that it's all slow decline of quality, and that happens very severely towards the end of the 1800s. By the early 1900s, there's a national resurgence in China. Civil war, almost unending civil war between one faction or the other. They depose the emperor. That's the end of imperial China. There's different kinds of nationalist government. The communists start making an entry in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. But they do something very smart. First is that they get support from the USSR after 1917. So the USSR then starts providing training, weapons, background, hinterland, what Pakistan does to India essentially in terms of Hizbul Mujahideen was what Russia was kind of, not an exact analogy. The second thing that happens is the communists were very smart in China. they allowed the nationalists, the government that now rules Taiwan, to fight the Japanese. And so the Japanese and the nationalist Chinese destroyed each other. Huge power vacuum, the communists take over and claim that they were the ones who fought. The communists never fought the Japanese in China. They claim they fought the Japanese, they never did. They hid out and they allowed the nationalists to destroy themselves fighting the Japanese, and then they just took over the country. It's that simple.
This is World War One.
This ends up being World War II. World War One was quite brutal with China, but it was still a period of civil war and occupation of the periphery. There was no attempt made at truly colonizing China till the 1930s by the Japanese. That was nasty. There were things like the rape of Nanjing, which was a systematic killing, slaughter of the Chinese by the Japanese army. You would have pregnant women getting bayoneted, being slit open from the vagina by Japanese swords, samurai swords, and things like that. There would be killing competitions between Japanese soldiers because the true master of the blade was seen as somebody who beheaded a Chinese peasant with a little bit of skin. You behead him from the back, but there should be a little bit of skin where the head remains attached to the throat. They used to do all these kinds of things. They had horrible chemical warfare units and experimentation where they take Chinese and freeze their legs off so that gangrene would set in and then smash it to see how the body reacts and things like that. It was serious sadistic crap, right?
Pre-World War II.
This is just pre-World War II. It's ultimately the events that 36, 37, 38, around that period. And mind you, the communists did nothing. They claim all the credit. They did absolutely nothing. It was Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, what we call the nationalists, what is today Taiwan's government, that were doing all the fighting against the Japanese.
Why are you saying it's Taiwan's government today?
Because what happened was the nationalists, they were so exhausted after World War II. The communists started taking everything over. They ran away to Taiwan. Taiwan was the only part of China that they could defend. So they continued to remain out there and built it up as a fortress. So, it's an island. Islands are very difficult to take. And the Chinese couldn't take it. They still can't.
Want to talk a little bit about the of Nanjing?
Yeah, sure.
Context.
So the context was that, the Japanese got into these very European ideas of racial superiority. That, Chinese are the inferior people, the Japanese are the superior master race, exactly like Hitler and Germans are the superior race, the Slavs are inferior, they're meant to be cattle, and Jews, of course, are to be killed. They are not even human beings worth keeping alive. And the Japanese had all these ideas with regards to China. And the sheer irony of all of this is that Japanese culture was completely influenced by Chinese. Even today there are 3 scripts in Japanese: the hiragana, the katakana, and the kanji. The kanji is all Japanese. Things. There is so much of the imperial formalized Japanese vocabulary that's directly from Chinese.
You're saying kanji is Chinese?
Chinese characters used in Japanese. I mean, they're modified, but yeah. But they create, you can create these stories of superiority. So for them, they were superior. They were the master race. The Koreans and the Chinese were slave races to be ruled over. And it is in this context that they invade China. And the more the resistance against the Japanese army, the more they would take it out on the local population, going around massacring people left, right, and center. And by the way, that was kind of the norm. People don't talk about this because, the Europeans want you to believe that they were much more civilized by the 1930s, that they weren't doing these massacres. Absolute rubbish. You look at what the Italians were doing in Libya. It was in fact the British who started concentration camps in South Africa during the Boer War in the late 1800s. Right? Take entire populations, hold them together, don't allow them to go do guerrilla warfare, and let them die by slow starvation, disease, and things like that. The Italians did it in Libya, and then people don't talk about this, but one of the biggest massacres was the Herero massacre by the Germans. Namibia, which is just north of South Africa, was a German colony. The entire Herero people were almost wiped out by the Germans. The Kaiser told his people, behave like Huns. They behaved like Huns, and that is where this entire First World War term, where the French and the British used to call the Germans Huns, came about from. There was what King Leopold of Belgium did in Congo, where 1 to 2 million people were just killed. Their hands used to be chopped off if they went meeting the rubber quota and things like that. These were horrible, horrible things that happened, but it was a sign of the times. Till 1920s, through the 1920s, in fact, when chemical weapons had stopped, this was after the First World War, Britain was using chemical weapons on Iraqis. Indian troops, in fact, were dropping those chemical weapons. Indian troops in the British Army.
What kind of chemical weapons?
Mustard gas, all these stuff which will just burn your eyes, burn your face, kills everybody, thousands at one shot. And Churchill was, in fact, a very avid enthusiast of using chemical weapons on brown native savages. So Iraq was one of those particular things where chemical weapons were used very liberally by the British. I think the difference comes about because even by the 30s, those European standards had kind of, let's say, they went as brutal because their own self-image was that we are Mother Teresa, or, well, whoever the equivalent was in those days. I know, Nightingale, Florence Nightingale. I'm Florence Nightingale. The European can't do this stuff, whereas the Japanese were like, hey, we're just starting out, bro. They started about 150 years late, so they had a lot of catching up to do. But they were behaving exactly as the Europeans did in the previous century, right? So it was the done thing in those days. And then, of course, the Germans got into the game and took it to a whole new level. Because that was the true introduction of industrialization to the genocide process. So the Germans become kind of the masters of it, but the Japanese are kind of competing with the Germans in how many people you can kill very systematically, how many nasty experiments you can do on human beings in camps. And it's always the sort of inferior races chosen for that kind of experimentation and massacre. Because most of the documents that would have directly implicated Hirohito were destroyed.
Why?
Because the Americans wanted to whitewash Hirohito to become an anti-communist bulwark against the USSR. So they were tasked. Initially, they had every intent of trying and executing Hirohito for war crimes. But MacArthur, who led the American occupation of Japan after World War II, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, decided very, very quickly that we need the emperor to stay in place so that Japan can become an industrial power again, become an ally, and be anti-USSR. And so all of the documents which would have probably shown that Hirohito was as crazy, if not crazier, I shouldn't use the word crazy, as psychotic, if not psychoticer than Hitler, were all destroyed. And it was the cabinet, General Tojo and people like that, who knew it was their job to die for the emperor and take the blame onto themselves. So every person charged at the Tokyo War Crimes trial refused to name the emperor or attribute blame to him, and they said, we did it. But there's enough circumstantial evidence to show that Hirohito knew exactly what was happening, and in many cases actually complained, saying, you're not killing enough Chinese people, kill more of them. Oh yeah. I mean, you'd think if you look at an image of Hirohito from those days, you'll see what a sweet old man. It's like that sweet old Japanese man in the Tokyo metro who's offering out little bars of mochi or, I know, chocolates or whatever. Oh no, this guy was all in, huh? He was every bit as psychotic as Hitler. The thing is, we don't have proof.
You know, if you meet a Korean person today and you warm up to them, eventually, this has been my experience, especially with the slightly older Koreans, they're pretty anti-Japan even today. There is like a bit of a cold energy between the two.
Yes, and you know, again, the Japanese also did a lot of good in Korea. They industrialized Korea. Korea had not industrialized by itself. The royal dynasty of Korea had failed miserably. The Japanese came and invaded because they sort of industrialized quicker than the Koreans did. So they immediately, their first target was Korea, conquered Korea, horrible atrocities, nasty, nasty stuff.
This is also pre-World War II.
Pre-World War II. This is in the late 1800s. So 1890s to the early 1900s. 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, conquer Korea, industrialize it forcibly, kill a lot of people, try to Japanicize them. Korean is the inferior language, Japanese is the superior language, everybody should learn. But they set up industries wherever they go. Unlike Britain, which never set up industry in India, Japan set up industry in Korea. Japan insisted that all Koreans would go to school and study Japanese and things like that. They educated the Koreans. The Koreans get very upset when you tell them this, you see, that had it not been for the Japan, you can't really call it human investment. It was really to exploit the Koreans as modern day slave labor. It was nasty. They killed a lot of them as well. But they laid the roots for Korean industrialization.
And we're talking about both North and South here.
Yes, both North and South. Both North and South. And people don't realize this, but North Korea was a success story again till 1979.
Yeah.
South Korea was the great failure. The North was the great success, right? But the roots were laid by Japanese imperialism.
Let's deep dive into the Korean aspect of things. But let's also first complete the Chinese story. Because we began then, we were leading up to Mao.
Leading up to Mao. Now, Mao comes in. Why? Because the Japanese have been defeated. He's got the backing of Stalin. The nationalists have been destroyed because they fought heart and soul to protect China. They lost their entire army fighting Japan. They're completely exhausted. They get crushed in a year's time. Imagine China is such a huge country, 9 million plus square kilometers, almost 10 million square kilometers, wiped out within the space of a year. It also helped, of course, that Stalin was holding Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist leader, his son hostage in Siberia. And Chiang Kai-shek was so obsessed with his son's well-being, he had many opportunities to destroy the communists. He didn't because his son was being held hostage. So it was literally, for want of the son, the kingdom was lost. That kind of a story. He accepts the loss of the whole of China, dies a broken man in Taiwan. Mao comes. Now, again, there are lots of competing leaders within the party. But Mao is the most psychotic and most brutal of the lot. He knows he copies a lot of Stalin's tactics. Anytime anyone comes up to challenge him, he concocts some kind of spy story or whatever and has them killed. Exact Stalin playbook. And that was it. And he controlled it. But his break from China's past, because society is destroyed. When you're 70 million, and in those days, 70 million people dying in all these famines that he induces. The Chinese population at that time is 500 million, bro. It's like, 15-20% of your population getting killed off like that. No society can survive that kind of decimation. Social structures break down, and that in a sense makes it a lot easier for his successor Deng Xiaoping to start industrializing China. Good, bad, evil, I don't know. So in many ways you can say that even though Deng Xiaoping built modern China, had Mao Zedong not destroyed ancient China, maybe Deng Xiaoping couldn't have built modern China. Maybe.
Mao probably created hard times that led to the creation of hard human beings.
Exactly.
And those hard human beings worked towards building